On August 6, 2025, a fault line running deep beneath Israeli society ruptured into the open, exposing a profound and dangerous schism between the nation's political leaders and its military command. The moment of rupture came when Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, facing immense pressure from his far-right coalition partners, formally announced his intention to seek the Security Cabinet's approval for a full and indefinite occupation of the Gaza Strip. He framed this drastic measure as the only path to total victory over Hamas, a final, decisive action to end the protracted conflict once and for all. This declaration was not just a policy proposal, it was an ultimatum aimed at a war-weary nation and a military already stretched to its breaking point. The response from the Israel Defense Forces was as swift as it was shocking. In an unprecedented act of public dissent, the military's chief of staff, Herzi Zamir, openly refused to endorse the Prime Minister's directive. He argued that such an operation was not only operationally untenable, but also morally catastrophic. Instead of preparing for a deeper ground invasion, Zamir had already begun to quietly withdraw some IDF brigades from the ruins of Gaza, a clear signal that the military believed it had reached the absolute limit of what force could achieve. The chasm between the government's political ambitions and the military's grim assessment of reality had become too wide to ignore, setting the stage for a constitutional crisis. This public break represents the culmination of months of simmering tension. While the government has consistently broadcasted a message of impending victory, the defense establishment has been grappling with a far darker reality on the ground. Military leaders have privately warned that the political objective of eradicating every last Hamas fighter from its subterranean fortress is a dangerous fantasy. They contend that the strategic goals of the war were met months ago, with Hamas's capacity to launch large-scale attacks on Israel effectively dismantled. The Prime Minister's push for a full reoccupation, in their view, is driven not by military necessity, but by political survival and ideological fervor. The standoff has left Israel at its most vulnerable moment since the war began. The government is demanding an action that its own military command has deemed reckless and impossible to execute without incurring devastating costs. The Chief of Staff, backed by a significant portion of the defense establishment, including hundreds of retired senior officials, has drawn a line in the sand, prioritizing the welfare of his soldiers and the lives of the remaining hostages over the political demands of the cabinet. This internal conflict has paralyzed the state's decision-making process, leaving a nation holding its breath as it awaits the outcome of a battle not against an external enemy, but within its own halls of power. The military's refusal to march deeper into Gaza is rooted in a severe and worsening crisis of human suffering within its own ranks. Chief of Staff Zamir's primary argument against a full occupation is the unbearable toll the war has already taken on his soldiers. The numbers are grim and speak to a level of psychological devastation not seen in previous conflicts. According to internal reports that have shaken the defense establishment, more than 50 Israeli soldiers have died by suicide while serving in Gaza. This horrifying statistic is compounded by the fact that over 10,000 active-duty soldiers are currently receiving treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder and other severe psychological trauma, a figure that grows with each passing week of combat. Morale across the IDF has plummeted to historic lows. Many soldiers have been deployed for months beyond their scheduled terms of service, trapped in a seemingly endless cycle of grueling urban warfare with no clear endgame in sight. They have witnessed unimaginable destruction and loss, fighting an elusive enemy in a landscape of rubble while knowing that a political solution remains distant. The promise of a swift victory has long since evaporated, replaced by the grim reality of a protracted and bloody stalemate. This exhaustion has led to a collapse in morale, with commanders reporting that the fighting spirit of their units has been critically eroded, making the prospect of a full-scale occupation not just dangerous, but potentially unsustainable. Furthermore, the military command has come to a sobering conclusion about the limits of its operational capabilities. Chief of Staff Zamir bluntly stated in a recent security briefing, "We've reached the limit of military operations. We've leveled Gaza, but Hamas fighters remain underground." This admission reflects the military's assessment that further ground incursions would yield diminishing returns at an exponentially higher cost in Israeli lives. The IDF has destroyed vast swaths of Gaza's infrastructure, but the labyrinthine tunnel network remains largely intact, allowing Hamas to survive and regroup. The military believes that continuing to throw soldiers at this problem is a futile strategy that fails to address the core political issues driving the conflict. The most immediate and agonizing factor for the IDF command is the fate of the remaining Israeli hostages. Intelligence assessments delivered to the War Cabinet have issued a stark warning. Any major IDF ground operation near the locations where the 50 remaining captives are believed to be held would almost certainly trigger their immediate execution by their Hamas captors. For the military, which operates under an ethos of leaving no soldier behind, the idea of pursuing a strategy that would amount to a death sentence for the hostages is unconscionable. This places the IDF in direct opposition to politicians who are willing to sacrifice the hostages for the abstract goal of total victory. The simmering conflict between the military and the government boiled over during a recent, exceptionally tense Security Cabinet meeting. The session, intended to forge a unified path forward, instead became a battleground of recriminations and threats. Prime Minister Netanyahu, flanked by his far-right allies, presented his case for the full conquest of Gaza, arguing that anything less would be perceived as a victory for Hamas. He painted a picture of a decisive final assault that would secure Israel's borders for a generation, a narrative that his political base has been conditioned to expect. The atmosphere was charged with political pressure, as the Prime Minister made it clear that he viewed any opposition as a challenge to his authority. Chief of Staff Herzi Zamir countered with a cold dose of reality, methodically laying out the military's grave concerns. He presented the alarming statistics on soldier suicides and PTSD, the intelligence reports warning of the imminent danger to hostages, and the operational assessment that Hamas could not be defeated by purely military means. His presentation was not one of defiance but of professional duty, a commander's solemn responsibility to report the facts from the field. He argued that the government was asking the IDF to achieve a political objective with a military tool that was not only ill-suited for the task, but was also breaking under the strain. He implored the cabinet to consider a diplomatic path to secure the hostages' release. The confrontation escalated dramatically when the far-right ministers, National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir and Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich, launched a direct and personal attack on the Chief of Staff. Smotrich, dismissing Zamir's warnings, reportedly sneered that he preferred Zamir's predecessor, Herzi Halevi, a comment designed to undermine Zamir's authority and question his courage. The insult was a clear attempt to politicize the military command and bully it into submission. According to sources in the room, the remark was the final straw for Zamir, who refused to engage in the political theater. He stood up, gathered his papers, and walked out of the meeting, leaving the politicians in stunned silence. This dramatic exit has been widely interpreted as a point of no return. It symbolized the complete breakdown of trust and communication between the political echelon and the professional military corps. The Prime Minister's allies have since hardened their position, with senior officials leaking statements to the press that the die is cast for a full conquest, and that if the Chief of Staff does not agree, he should resign. The showdown has transformed a policy disagreement into a fundamental crisis over the role of the military in a democracy, and who ultimately bears responsibility for the lives of soldiers and captives when political ambition collides with military reality. The relentless pressure for a full reoccupation of Gaza is most intensely applied by the far-right members of Netanyahu's coalition, for whom the conflict is not just about security, but about ideology and historical redemption. National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir and Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich are, the primary architects of this push, advocating not only for military conquest but also for the re-establishment of Jewish settlements in the Gaza Strip. Their vision extends far beyond the stated war aim of dismantling Hamas. It is a vision of permanent Israeli control over the territory, rooted in a deep-seated belief in a greater Israel that encompasses the biblical lands of Judea, Samaria, and Gaza. For Itamar Ben-Gvir, the motivation is deeply personal and tied to a sense of historical grievance. He and his wife were among the thousands of Israeli settlers who were forcibly evicted from the Gush Katif settlement block during Israel's 2005 disengagement from Gaza. That event, ordered by then Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, was seen by the settler movement as a profound national trauma and a betrayal. For Ben-Gvir, returning to Gaza as a conqueror and re-establishing a Jewish presence there would be a form of personal and political vindication. It would reverse what he considers a historic mistake and reclaim land he believes is divinely promised to the Jewish people, making the current war a fateful opportunity. This ideological campaign reached a flashpoint on August 6, 2025, with a highly provocative event at the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound in Jerusalem, a site holy to both Muslims and Jews. Ben-Gvir led a group of approximately 4,000 Israeli settlers in a march through the compound, a place Jews revere as the Temple Mount. In a move that shattered decades of fragile status quo, the settlers brought Torah artifacts and prayed openly throughout the site. This was widely seen as a deliberate act to assert Jewish sovereignty over the holy site and a symbolic step toward the Judaization of Jerusalem, inflaming religious tensions across the region and infuriating the Muslim world. The timing of this event was no coincidence. It served as a powerful declaration of intent, linking the war in Gaza to a broader religious and nationalist crusade. Hamas and other Palestinian factions immediately condemned the act as part of a frenzied Judaization campaign, using it as a rallying cry and reinforcing their narrative of defending Islam's holy sites from Israeli aggression. For the far right, the storming of Al-Aqsa and the push to resettle Gaza are two fronts in the same war, a war to reshape the demographic and religious character of the land, regardless of the diplomatic, human, or military cost. This ideological fervor leaves little room for compromise or negotiation. While politicians debate grand strategies of conquest, a different and more desperate conversation is taking place across Israeli society. The families of the 50 remaining hostages have become the moral center of the public discourse, their anguish a constant and painful reminder of the human stakes of the government's decisions. They are furious with the Prime Minister's focus on total victory, a slogan they see as a hollow promise that directly endangers their loved ones. For them, every day that passes without a deal is another day of terror, a reality made visceral by recent images released by Hamas showing two emaciated hostages, their gaunt faces a shocking portrait of suffering. These families have transformed their grief into a powerful political movement, holding daily vigils and protests outside the Prime Minister's residence and the Ministry of Defense. Their message is simple and unwavering. Prioritize the lives of the living over the destruction of the enemy. They demand that the government abandon its military posturing and immediately enter into negotiations with Hamas to secure a deal for the hostages' return, even if it means ending the war. They argue that a full ground invasion would be a death sentence for the captives, a gamble no responsible government should be willing to take. Their pleas have resonated deeply with a public increasingly exhausted by the conflict. This sentiment is reflected in recent public opinion polls, which reveal a significant shift in Israeli attitudes. A staggering 74% of Israelis now say they favor a deal with Hamas to release the hostages, even if it requires ending the war and making significant concessions. This indicates a broad consensus that the primary goal of the state should be the return of its citizens. Furthermore, a growing sense of realism has set in regarding the war's initial objectives. A poll shows that 38% of Israeli Jews, a substantial minority, now believe that the complete disarming of Hamas is an impossible goal, a sign that the government's rhetoric of total victory is losing its hold on the public imagination. The nation is therefore torn. On one side are the hostage families and a majority of the public who are desperate for an end to the bloodshed and the safe return of the captives. They see negotiation as the only viable and humane path forward. On the other side is a government, heavily influenced by its far-right flank, that remains committed to a military solution, viewing any compromise with Hamas as a sign of weakness. This deep societal division mirrors the rift between the military and the politicians, creating a volatile environment where the government's next move will be judged not just by its strategic outcome, but by its moral implications for a nation in deep distress. As the internal conflict reaches a fever pitch, the Israeli Security Cabinet stands at a historic crossroads, facing three distinct and mutually exclusive paths forward. Each option carries its own set of profound risks and potential consequences, and the choice made in the coming days will likely define the future of the region for years to come. The decision has been described by insiders as the most important one since the war began, forcing a final, painful reckoning with the nation's priorities and its capacity to achieve them. The Prime Minister, the Chief of Staff, and the Cabinet must now weigh these stark choices, knowing that any path they take will be fraught with peril. The first option, championed by Prime Minister Netanyahu and his far-right allies, is to approve a full and indefinite occupation of the Gaza Strip. This path prioritizes the political goal of total victory above all else. It would involve sending tens of thousands of ground troops back into Gaza's most densely populated areas and tunnel networks in an attempt to completely eradicate Hamas's leadership and fighting force. Proponents argue this is the only way to ensure Israel's long-term security. However, this choice effectively means abandoning the remaining hostages, as the military has warned such an invasion would likely lead to their deaths. It also guarantees a bloody, protracted insurgency and immense international condemnation. The second option is to pivot toward diplomacy and negotiation. This path would require Israel to engage seriously with mediators and Hamas to secure a comprehensive deal for the release of all remaining hostages in exchange for an end to the war, the release of Palestinian prisoners, and significant humanitarian relief for Gaza. This choice is favored by the majority of the Israeli public, the hostage families, and a significant portion of the defense establishment. It offers the best chance of bringing the hostages home alive and ending the devastating cycle of violence. The primary risk is political. It would be seen as a victory for Hamas and could cause the immediate collapse of Netanyahu's right-wing government. The third and final option is to maintain the current status quo, a strategy of continued airstrikes and limited, targeted ground operations without committing to a full reoccupation. This approach represents a middle ground of sorts, an attempt to avoid the immense risks of a full invasion while still exerting military pressure on Hamas. The hope behind this strategy is that Hamas will eventually collapse under the sustained pressure or be forced to accept a deal on Israel's terms. However, this path also means condemning the people of Gaza to continued suffering and starvation, a protracted low-intensity conflict for Israeli soldiers, and leaving the hostages in a state of indefinite limbo, their fate uncertain as the war grinds on with no clear end. Israel now finds itself suspended in a moment of profound uncertainty, its future hanging in the balance as its leaders weigh three perilous choices. Each path forward is laden with risks that threaten to exacerbate the nation's existing crises. Opting for a full occupation of Gaza, as the Prime Minister desires, risks sacrificing the 50 remaining hostages, entangling the IDF in a bloody and unwinnable guerrilla war for years, and making Israel an international pariah. This path would answer the far-right's call for ideological conquest, but could trigger a catastrophic military and moral collapse, leaving the nation more isolated and less secure than ever before. Conversely, choosing to negotiate with Hamas to secure the hostages' release would force the government to confront a different set of dangers. While it would likely bring the captives home and end the immediate bloodshed, it would be framed by political opponents as a capitulation to terrorism. It could shatter the current government, embolden Israel's enemies, and leave the long-term security question of a weakened but surviving Hamas unresolved. This choice would prioritize human life over military pride, but it would come at a high political cost and leave the fundamental conflict to fester, potentially erupting again in the future. The question is whether any government can survive such a perceived defeat. The third option, continuing the current campaign of airstrikes and limited operations, offers a false sense of security. It avoids the immediate political fallout of a deal and the immense casualties of a full invasion, but it solves nothing. This path of strategic ambiguity risks a slow-burning disaster, where the humanitarian crisis in Gaza deepens, soldier morale continues to decay, and the hostages remain trapped in a state of suspended animation. It is a choice born of indecision, one that allows the conflict to fester while hoping for a miracle. This strategy kicks the can down a road littered with more death and destruction, without a clear destination in sight. As the Security Cabinet prepares to convene, the Israeli people are left to ponder a series of agonizing questions. What is the true definition of victory? Is it the complete eradication of an enemy, or is it the safe return of one's own citizens? How much more suffering, of soldiers, of civilians, of hostages, is the nation willing to endure for a political goal that its own military believes is unattainable? Can a democratic state survive when its political leaders and military commanders are so fundamentally at odds? The answers to these questions will not be found in military strategy or political rhetoric, but in the moral calculus of a nation forced to decide what and who it is willing to save.